100%. Yep. Volumetric efficiency at the end of the day, if we look at it properly, is every mechanical restriction from the air cleaner to the tailpipe. Yep. And every single element influences volumetric efficiency, right down to cam timing, valve size, port size, everything.
Green flag.
Welcome to the Blind Apex Podcast, where amateur club racers tune in to get faster.
This episode is brought to you by DHWorks Fuel Systems. Use Apex 10 at checkout to save 10% on fueling your passion. To support this podcast or any podcast, all we ask is you share it with friends. On this episode, I want to get into the basics of the induction or intake side of the engine. We live in a racing or time attack world where either we're seeking the most performance or we're seeking the best detuned power curve we can make to get to some power to weight ratio. I found my guest a couple of years ago researching and learning on YouTube. They make beautiful and effective induction systems, intakes, manifolds. They do head work, complete engine analysis. They are a guest from the future, from way down under. Jake from Bain Racing. Welcome to the podcast, sir.
How are you doing? Good to be here.
I'm great. I'm happy to have you here. I feel like after Grant and Andre, you're now part of my trifecta from Australia and New Zealand. So
Nice. Yeah, Andre's a nice guy.
Yeah, they're all good people. So I don't want to bury the lead because I got a lot of education from you.
Yeah.
And we're probably going to have to reference it a lot because this is a audio podcast. And
yeah.
So where can they find you on YouTube and Instagram?
Yeah, just Bain Racing at YouTube. It's pretty much all under Bain Racing. So they all tend to come up on Google and that. Nice and easy, nice and simple.
Good. So a little bit of your background. How long have you been in this section of the motorsports world? Probably,
Bain Racing's been going for 27 years. And then before that, I was pretty much building and helping and doing a lot of R&D, working with different shops behind the scene, even sometimes for free. Just, I did a lot of work with Ross Balancers in the early days when he was developing supercharger kits. So I helped him with a lot of that type of stuff and just moving around in different circles. But yeah, I've got a long history since I was a child, obviously, with my father and my granddad. My granddad was TT champion motorcycle racer. So, and then he was the head engineer for Valicet race bikes after the war. And he had a shop down at Concord there, or Enfield. And so I was always around bikes and sprint cars and race cars. And so it was sort of normal to me. And I actually sort of went off into the arts a little bit more and wasn't too interested, even though I did. It was just, something I knew and didn't think I was going to actually go into it, right? And then it just got to the point where I started building more and more cars. I think I built about 28 cars before I was sort of 18, 19. Just buy and build them and sell them and tune them and fix them and all that type of stuff just to get my knowledge base across a lot of different platforms, So I did everything from rotaries to 4 cylinders to V8s, and we raced 6 cylinders and all sorts of things. So yeah, and then the constant engagement with people, helping them all the time, and they're like, "Man, you should do this for a job." And that's sort of pretty much how it went. So.
I mean, if you enjoy doing it, why not get paid to do it, right?
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. 100%.
I would say most of our listeners are B-Series Honda, K-Series Honda, inline BMW, and LS-powered kits. So
right, yep.
That's generally what's powering stuff in the paddock these days, I think.
Yeah, right.
So just to put that in perspective.
Yep.
I'm not exactly sure how we want to start. So let me ask you,
Yep.
what do we need to know about our engines before we start looking to modify the intake side of the engine? Like, what in the engine influences the intake side the most?
Pretty much just RPM, obviously. RPM's a big one. The cylinder head, the type of use you're using it for. So obviously an intake in drag racing is very different to an intake in circuit racing. Even though they're following the same principles and we're using the same maths, we just target different airspeeds slightly. You know, like a circuit car, we're generally looking for more area under the curve, even though in a drag racing engine we still do, but the operating window in a well set up drag car is really only 1500 RPM. Where, as you know, a circuit car, we want 3,500 or more, you know. So RPM's a big one, and then obviously compression and cam and all those other things that are going to start adding to our harmonic elements, you know, the how the sound waves move up and down the runner. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm assuming you're going to look at a lower, what would you define as a low compression?
Probably 10-1 would be a low compression.
And then anything above that, you're creeping into normal to high. Where would you define a high compression engine?
It obviously depends on fuel, but it's sort of once you start getting over 13, 14-1, you're starting to get into the, you know, serious end of compression.
Okay, so somewhere between 10 and 13 is let's call it normal.
It's pretty normal. Like we have OEM engines now with 12-1 and, you know, bikes at, you know, maybe 13-1. So, yeah.
Okay. So in the compression side, if we're running low, generally we could go boosted, but some of us have to run low compression cars.
Yeah.
Like factory engines. So if they're at 10-1 from the factory versus a 13-1 build, you know, what does that sort of influence overall?
Mainly just obviously the harmonics and the way the engine accelerates. So generally a higher comp engine will like a little bit more cross-sectional area because it's going to come on a lot faster. So if we look at the extreme in this example, let's say a top fuel, it does like 700 revolutions from, you know, start to max RPM, where an engine like ours will accelerate at maybe 200 RPM per second or so on, right? So it's about how, and this is how comp tends to help engines accelerate. Obviously, there's inertia mechanism, so how heavy your flywheel is and balancer and all that sort of stuff. This is why, you know, lightened components with high compression work so well in NA engines, because we're able to accelerate the engine faster, you know. So that has a little effect. And then obviously cam timing and how the wave's going up the runner. So we've got to look at how quick the engine accelerates, and that can tend to change the cross-sectional area even on the exact same RPM engines. And obviously we're also changing our volumetric efficiency. So compression helps with that acceleration away from TDC. So which influences other cylinders to fill. So we also got to look at that, because a lot of people don't realize, even though an engine's at 1,000 RPM at idle, it's actually doing 800, 1,200, 800, 1,200. On a four-cylinder, it'll be doing it every 180 degrees, right? Every time we have a compression stroke, the piston slows down, and then when that fires, it accelerates away from TDC. So we don't have a constant velocity in the crankshaft ever, hence why we need a harmonic balancer to dampen the amplitude of that wave, right? And the higher the comp goes up, the higher this amplitude is, right? So, yeah, there's quite a few aspects there.
Okay. So I plan this out to sort of talk about considerations we should be making for every piece of the induction system, right?
Yep.
So do you want to work from the engine out or from the filter to the engine?
Yeah, from the engine out, it's fine. The most important generally starts at valve and combustion chamber. So we have a priority of systems, and the priority starts at the valve and the combustion chamber design. And as we come out, we have less priority, right? So the bell mouth at the end of the runner isn't is nowhere near as important as the seat profile, right? Because that's our critical area right as it's going into the cylinder. So, yeah.
Okay. So the seat profile, what about how the manifold mates to the head and the shape of the the shape that's going in?
Yep. So we generally want to extend the port center line. The longer we can extend the port center line, meaning the line that comes up the center of the port. So if we had an imaginary line, if we looked at the port sideways and the line that extends out of the port, the longer we can extend that center line, and this is the same rule on exhausts. The longer we can carry the exhaust center line, the more horsepower you make. That's why you see a big difference between dyno pipes and then when someone actually puts the engine in the car with tight headers, right? You lose 30, 40 horsepower. So the intake is exactly the same because what we're trying to do is stabilize the airflow that goes into the port. So if we actually kick the runner up a little bit, so say we go higher than the port itself, we generally tend to make more torque because it'll actually shrink the port slightly and it'll shift our power down a little bit lower. So you will see more torque and it limits horsepower because it's actually dynamically shrinking the cross-sectional area. And the easiest way to think about this is when you go down a slippery dip and you hit the bottom part and it starts to come back up and you feel the force, your G-force sink into it, right? Well, the air does the exact same thing. If we kick the manifold up slightly from the center line, it's going to come in and compress along that floor. So we're going to get a thin density zone across the roof and we're going to get a more dense zone across the floor where the majority of the air is. But the drama of that is it tends to want to lift off the short turn. So you're limiting RPM, but you're increasing torque. And then vice versa. If we actually kick the manifold down a degree or so from the center line, you'll actually extend RPM and make more horsepower. So there's little, even exact same cross-sectional area, everything's exactly the same, just that angle of the manifold will change how the engine works because it's how we manage the air going into the port. It influences, you can do all the flow testing in the world you want, but the instant you put a manifold on, it'll actually change the velocity strategy in the port. And that's basically what we're doing. So in like pro stock and stuff like that with those intakes, we actually kick them down nearly a full degree, a degree and a half, because we're trying to get more velocity across the roof to help stabilize the short turn for that turn. Because that's the problem, turning into a cylinder. And the two valves are really, really bad for it, but the Honda stuff are absolutely brilliant. It's probably one of the best twin cam cylinder heads out there. They're great. Like you can look in them and see, probably 70-80% of the valve seat, and that tells you straight away. Yeah.
It's a curse for me. I have to detune my car. So
yeah. That's crazy.
It's a little tough, but so you mentioned velocity and with the manifolds, the design of different manifolds that are out there.
Yeah.
There's length of the runners, there's volume, where they add volume to the manifold.
Yeah.
How is all of that balanced out, or how should we be looking at volume versus velocity or volume and length, or even oversized runners or smaller runners? How do we look at that in the manifold?
So we look at it from an average velocity standpoint. So what we need to establish first is what velocity do we need? And this is the problem around flow benches and everything like that. They'll always tell you something bigger is better, but in reality, you need the right size for the right RPM. So we have a dynamic calculation that we use, which is a minimal cross-sectional area. And we generally target around 613, 620 feet per second on that calculation. So that's looking at the cubic capacity and the RPM where you want it to work. So that'll tell you if the velocity is right for the RPM that you need. And then the other aspect is obviously runner length in that. So we have our physical inertia tuning, so a supercharged inertia mechanism. So we're creating velocity to fill that cylinder after bottom dead center, because people need to realize the valve is open well after bottom dead center. The piston's actually coming up up the bore as air's still filling the cylinder. And we're using that air force to actually fill the cylinder beyond 100% if you're making more than 100% VEs. And that force, because people don't realize air has a lot of weight. If you just put your hand out at 60 mile an hour, you'll feel that weight on your hand. Well, the port's doing 400 plus mile an hour. So there's a lot of weight there that we can use that weight and force to continue filling the cylinder as the piston's coming up the bore. And that's modern engines in a nutshell. That's the mechanism we're using. So that's called an inertia supercharged filling. And if we don't size that right, the air actually stalls in the runner. The optimal goal in this is to create velocity, fill that cylinder as the piston's coming up the bore, and just as the air starts to stall, we shut the valve. We've got as much as we can in there. That's the physical side of it. Then we have the harmonic side of it, the sound element, and the wave will go up and down the runner. And this is where runner length plays into this mechanism. So, and it's worth about 5 to 7% more horsepower. If we can get the wave to arrive right as that valve is closing or just before it closes, now we can get an extra bit of dense air, like it was turbocharged, pushed into that cylinder right before we close the valve. And then we increase VEs even more. So Pro Stock and Formula One back in the day were doing this so well, they were seeing about 17 to 18 PSI at the valve. So they were able to increase the pressure higher than atmospheric pressure. So rather than 14.7 or depending where you're racing, that they were seeing 17, 18 PSI. So they were able to see more than atmospheric pressure due to this wave tuning, because you'll have a dense zone that comes down from that sound wave. And there's actually two. There's one when the valve opens and there's one when the valve closes. And if we can time these in with the runner length that we tune the runner length, then we get the best of both worlds. So we've got the velocity from the length of the inertia and the size, and then we have the wave tuning on top of that as a bonus. So yeah.
Okay. And so what about okay, you said that on the flow bench, they're always going to say bigger is always better, but that is not the case, correct? Bigger is not always better.
No, definitely not.
So that leads me to the throttle body, because everyone wants a bigger throttle body. Yeah, but not everybody needs another throttle body.
No, that's right.
And is there a rule?
Yeah, pretty much there is a rule, and I use an airspeed target. So if you can work it out on how much air the engine's actually using, and we target between 150 to 200 feet per second. So on a drag car will be 150, maybe 125 even, and in a circuit car we're about 200 feet per second. That will give you the best of, you might lose 5 horsepower up top, but you'll make a more average, right, with higher air speeds at the throttle, and you'll have more throttle sensitivity. And this is the problem. In almost all tests, you can put a bigger throttle body on and you'll make more horsepower and more torque. So you don't really lose anything other than that throttle sensitivity, which, as you know, in a circuit car you need. You don't want 100% of the throttle body in the first 15 degrees of throttle movement. And that's the problem with going too big, right? You lose that sensitivity, and you're not able to get the TPS where you want it coming out of corners and stuff like that. So that's why, as I say, generally I wouldn't, for circuit stuff, we don't go under about 150 feet per second. So that's why I ended up building the Einstein Motors platform, so people can just put their horsepower and stuff in there and it'll tell them what size they need, rather than overshooting it and having a car that's, hard to stop the wheels turning and, keep traction and stuff like that, because their throttle sensitivity is out the window,
Yeah. So let's talk about that calculator. Is it on your website?
It's on Einstein Motors, so they're all up there. So I think I've got 75 different calculators, and we've got constant new ones coming and stuff like that. Everything from airflow to air cleaner size to drag racing to the coefficient of the shape of the car to show people how body shape changes the speed of your car, because in drag racing it's drag, meaning air is an element we're fighting against, right? Same in circuit cars. That's why you see the slimmer the car at the exact same horsepower will always be a lot faster, because it doesn't have as much mass to move out of the way, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So we talked a little bit about torque in the manifold and a little bit about torque with you said you could get more torque even with a bigger throttle body measurement, right?
Yeah.
So what is that relationship? Because in the circuit racing, we always want more torque, right?
Yeah. Well, basically what it's doing is reducing the velocity through the throttle body. Anytime we have air speed, we have a density reduction. So the instant air moves, pressure drops. So this is Bill Muley's principle. So as if we've got 250 feet per second at that throttle body, and we've got a small plenum, and this is the other aspect that falls into it. A lot of people will compensate for a poor plenum volume with a bigger throttle body, because it will help to a certain extent, right? That the plenum is meant to be a pressure recovery area. So if the airspeed, because we don't want even 100 feet per second inside the plenum itself, because as I said, the higher that airspeed goes up, the more density drops. And not only that, air that's moving across runners is hard to turn because it's generating inertia. So if it's not flowing in the right direction when cylinder one opens, or, we've just finished cylinder one and then another cylinder's opening, because a lot of people don't realize it doesn't go this cylinder, then that cylinder, then that cylinder. The more camshaft and the more comp we have in the engine, the more overlap we see between multiple cylinders, meaning one cylinder is, on its finishing cycle, it's still filling, and the other cylinder's starting to say, hey, I need some air here. So air has to change direction really, really fast. And when it does, that creates inertia and then robs that cylinder of air mass. So back to your throttle body point is, as we increase the throttle body size, we slow the velocity down. So we actually have denser air behind the throttle body. But then the plenum volume is also going to be an aspect of that. This is why we need a good deceleration zone after the throttle body. And you'll see this in good manifolds. You see it in a lot of the K manifolds. They have like a neck down where the throttle body is, and they taper up to the plenum. That's our decel zone. So we can take that throttle body to 150 feet per second and slow it down to 75 feet per second. So now the air can turn into that cylinder much easier, because that's the other drama. If the throttle body's too small and the plenum's too parallel, that air will skip right across the first runner, and you'll just choke that cross-sectional area. So that cylinder really isn't working. And the higher the RPM you go, the worse that cylinder becomes, because the air velocity is increasing. So it just skips across. It doesn't want to turn. It's like us in a race car. If we go too fast into that apex, we'll shoot straight across it. We won't go around the corner. And air is the same. It has weight just like we do, but we don't see it. It's much easier to see it in water. You put your hand in and pull your hand through the water, and you'll see the eddies that form behind it, right? But that water doesn't want to turn, just like air doesn't, but obviously at a different ratio, because it's much thinner. But yeah.
Okay. I think the relationship, and then talking about it, I guess I had the misconception of like faster in, the better it goes, right? Like not to slow it down and provide the volume, because there's so much overlap that's going to be needed by all the cylinders as they're firing at 8,000 RPMs or whatever we're doing.
Yeah, it can. And and this is where you can sometimes see more torque with a really bad plenum, because you're creating more turbulence, and the turbulence tends to eat up cross-sectional area. And we see this with ITBs. ITBs, they're pretty much torque on demand, right? If you need more torque, you don't give it as much throttle, right? So if you come out of a corner at your 3,500, you don't want to be at full throttle if the induction is tuned right. You actually want to be part throttle, half throttle even. And this will create cross-sectional area and bring the airspeed up in the port, because it'll actually make the port look smaller. And this is why ITB really have dominated in circuit racing for millennia, right? Because they've been such a good thing. We can put a really big cylinder head on something and put a throttle body in front of it and create turbulence and choke that port size, right? But the same sort of thing happens with the throttle body, but the better the plenum gets, and generally torque isn't an aspect of plenum volume. Torque is runner length and cross-sectional area if it's done right. But this is the problem. So many things aren't done right, so they can sort of lead you up the garden path thinking, oh, I should be doing this and I should be doing that, you know?
Well, some of us stuck with factory manifolds. Yeah. All those manifolds had to fit into a package, right?
Right.
Like if you have the ability to make a custom one or have a custom one made,
yep,
the world becomes your oyster, right? Because as long as, well, I mean, you're still confined to the package, the engine bay of your vehicle, right?
Yep.
So
100%.
There's still things to take into account. But
yep,
if you're pulling a front wheel drive minivan manifold and trying to put it into something that has more space, maybe you can, pick a different manifold. So
yeah, definitely. But you generally with plenum volume, you can't really hurt anything with plenum volume. So if you can get a little bit more plenum volume into most intakes, they generally benefit everywhere. So mainly because it comes back down to that airspeed. We're slowing airspeed down, so we have more denser air available for when that valve opens and when that induction cycle starts in that, 1, 2, 3, whatever it may be. Dense air is there ready for it. So, yeah. So other aspects we've done, just modifying factory plenums where we cut the plenum off, put a bigger plenum on, do a nice, and even running the same size throttle body, they're generally always better. So,
okay.
and that carries across to boosted type stuff. We were doing 1,500 horsepower 2Js with 75 mil throttle bodies, but we had 3.5 liter plenums on them, so we had plenty of plenum volume. Yeah, and the moving the throttle body away from the front cylinder. That's the other aspect. So you generally want a good couple of inches away from the first cylinder so it can slow down, right? Because that is an apex. If we think of the same as a car, if we're coming into the corner, we've got to get our speed right to make the turn. The throttle body is too fast. So if we move the throttle body away and it can come into the plenum, then slow down before the turn, it's a much better manifold. So,
I never thought about it that way.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, a common problem. Yeah, I do a ton of analysis, and people send me their designs and stuff. And the biggest mistake I see is people put a plate on the end of the plenum. Obviously, a plate isn't great because we have eddies after it. So, and they put it right on the front cylinder, which means it's going to start off really, really fat, and then it's going to end up really, really lean, or vice versa. Sorry. Yeah. So.
Yeah. Okay. All right, so we're moving away from the engine, and in theory, less important. But I still think it's all part of the system, right?
100%.
So,
Yep. Volumetric efficiency at the end of the day, if we look at it probably, is every mechanical restriction from the air cleaner to the tailpipe. Yep. And every single element influences volumetric efficiency, right down to cam timing, valve size, port size, everything. Yep.
For sure. So, okay, let's talk about your intake tube length versus diameter.
Yeah.
And this is where I feel most people start worrying about thermal conductivity. Like, for whatever reason, maybe I don't know why they think of it there, and they're not worried about where their manifold is or protecting their manifold. But can we talk about this section of the induction system?
Yep. Yeah. So as far as taper and length go, obviously the length we have to tune to where we want it to RPM. So, and this is another aspect in drag racing, we'll tune bang on to red line. So in like super stock and stuff like that, we're tuning for 10,500 RPM, right? Because the engines will overshoot on shift as well, because you don't want them dropping back below peak torque. You want them in front of peak torque. But in a circuit car, if your peak RPM, say 9,000 RPM, you actually want to dial runner length in at maybe 8,000 RPM, because generally we're not always ringing it to, in a circuit car, we're using that area under the curve. So we want the additional average horsepower to be in a more usable area. So we generally want our harmonic length an inch and a half longer than what it would be at our peak RPM. And that'll tend to help us get more area under that curve that we can actually use. And then the diameter itself is how we tune the torque and horsepower in. So if we want more torque, we run a closer or smaller CSA. A more parallel runner will give you more torque. If we want more horsepower, we have more taper in the runner itself, and that will get you more horsepower or push the power more up in the higher RPM curve, right? Because it comes back to that velocity again. Velocity is our choke. So at our minimal cross-sectional area, the limit of air by physics is around about that 0.55 to 0.6 Mach. And if you just divide 1,116 feet per second, which is the speed of sound at room temperature, that gives you a good estimate of how fast you can actually flow in the induction system, right? So, but this taper in the induction system, as we open it and close it, that you can actually dial the engine in. So guys that have played on the dyno, we've done it with different manifolds, same length, and just change that cross-sectional area, and you'll see the power come in earlier or the power will come in late. And what we tend to do is target the airspeed at the entry to work out what it actually needs. And on a true third harmonic, meaning if we've designed the manifold for a proper harmonic length, we're targeting about 180 feet per second in the entry of the manifold. Shorter manifolds, you might be targeting 220 or even 240 feet per second. And then you've also got to adjust your radius to that velocity, right? So the higher velocities will need a bigger radius because we have more speed. Just like a car, the faster we go through, the longer that radius in the apex needs to be, right? The slower it is, the quicker we can get around it. So air is exactly the same. So when we slow the airspeed down at the plenum, so a lot of people go bigger cross-sectional area and bigger radius, but that's wrong. As you open it up and slow the airspeed down, you actually want to shrink the radius, because you're actually shortening the runner by adding bigger radiuses, and you're washing out that harmonic signal that you're trying to use for extra horsepower. So, yeah.
Okay. So let's talk about the thermal conductivity aspect of all of this, because it seems like people are like, ooh, cold air intake or short ram intake, and they're either made out of stainless or silicon or something, right? Like,
yeah,
or a combination, So can we talk about that as far as the induction system goes?
Yeah, well, when it comes to manifolds, depending on whether it's a dry manifold, how high your injector is, if you've got something with a high injector position, you generally want an aluminium manifold, because we need a certain amount of heat in the boundary layer. And a warm boundary layer tends to be more slippery, so it has less drag than a cold one, right? We're seeing this in tests now with plastic carburetor manifolds, so 3D printed manifolds. They don't tend to be fueling as well, and they don't tend to be making as good horsepower. A straight dry flow, you're not too bad. If you got port injection, then you can have a polymer manifold and stuff like that. You're trying to retain, obviously, as much density as you can, because if we can get 10-degree air in the cylinder versus 25, 30-degree air, then it's obviously going to make more power. But there's a balance here, because we have to create that atomization. This is why DI, direct injection, is really sort of taking over, because we don't have to worry about that atomization as much. The high pressure DI injectors is 10 times smaller fuel droplet, so that SMD, the solder mean diameter of the fuel, is much, much smaller in DI injectors than it is port injectors, right? And there's also a bit of misconception as far as carburetors go. It's like people say, oh, carburetors need a heap of, turbulence because they've got to atomize the fuel better. A carburetor, or a good carby, I should say, it has a far smaller fuel molecule droplet than EFI does. So generally EFI is, 5 to 8 times bigger than the droplet coming out of a carby, because they do atomize the fuel really, really well with emulsion tubes and all that sort of stuff. So there's a few aspects we've got to look at. Obviously the fuel itself and what it's doing as far as that density recovery, that latent heat of vaporization, that drops the density. So we're giving away energy when we phase change fuel from a liquid to a gas. And you'll see this when you pour fuel on your hand starts to feel cold because it's starting to vaporize off your skin, right? Same thing happens to air. We transfer the energy into the air and the air drops down. We see this with water injection and water and methanol injection. Spray into the intake, bring the inlet air temperature charge down, and it tends to make more horsepower, right? So, yeah, there's quite a few aspects to that. And then that extends into the engine bay. The more we can insulate that induction and have the best cold air, and you notice this from a cold night to a hot day, the car, especially NA and even in boosted, its whole characteristics change. It's doughy now in the warm weather. It doesn't want to come on, where a nice cold night on a road and, yeah, it's on.
Yeah, throttle response is crisp in the cold. It's amazing.
Yeah, 100%. So, yeah, we
definitely want to get 16 years old.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So, okay. So let's talk about the last-ish portion, right?
Yeah.
The filter and I'm going to ask a pointed question if velocity stacks are worth it.
In what aspect? Velocity stacks?
Like at the end of a intake system, or with a velocity stack with a filter fitted on top of it.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Well, generally, a lot of good filters will have some sort of bell mouth built into them, because we never want to pull air over a sharp edge. And again, I use the analogy of the car. It's far easier to go around a nice radius bend than it is a right angle corner, right? So air is exactly the same thing. You'll form that vena contract. The air will want to tear off that edge. So it'll actually make the induction pipe. So if we've got a 3-inch pipe, the general common rule is we'll see 25% reduction in that. So now you might only have a 2.5-inch pipe, simply because you've got a hard edge there. And the air doesn't want to go right angle. It wants to make a nice curve into the induction pipe. So if you've got a nice radius on top of it, it's definitely going to encourage more mass going into that induction system. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So is there anything else we missed in the system? I mean, most of us are running NA, to be honest. So
yeah.
There's no need to get into superchargers or turbochargers.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you have videos on that. So
yeah, definitely. Yeah, no, just a cleaner size is another big one I see. So that's why I also build a calculator measuring pressure drop on cleaner, just to get adequate surface area, because people don't realize just how much air cleaner surface area you need. This is why you're generally better off getting away from panels and going to cylindrical type stuff, because now we can use pi 3.142 to increase that surface area by its length, right? So
right.
And that reduces, and this again comes back to airspeed. The bigger the air cleaner gets, the slower the airspeed is going through the cleaner. So the less friction we're creating in the filter itself. So we're not creating heat, because people don't realize a small air cleaner, air creates friction because it's trying to get through there too quickly. So it's going to rub, and molecules are going to collide and bounce off each other, and that creates friction, and then air temp goes up. So now we've lost mass, we've lost density. So the bigger air cleaner slows down the velocity through the air cleaner. So the air getting in there is cooler. We have more mass, and we're going to make more horsepower, even before we look at the pressure drop issues that small cleaners will create, right? So, yeah.
Okay.
Definitely.
So let's talk about, if I were to come to you and ask for an evaluation or help in a design or have you make me custom manifold or intake system, what kind of information do I need to bring to you or have prepared before we have our conversation?
Depends on how far you want to go. Like when I'm working with race teams or anyone who's in a series or something like that, we get as much data as we can, from dyno test to velocity tests on the flow bench to port size, valve size, throat size. Even throat size will change it. Cam timing down every part of the cam. So hopefully the cams have been cam doctored and we can see not just advertised and at 50 or 40, we can see 200, 300, we can see the whole shape and the velocity of the camshaft, because you need to map that to piston demand, right? As that disc goes down the bore, that 4-inch disc pulling on, say, a 2-inch valve or whatever, the rate at which, because the piston doesn't move at a steady rate, it accelerates to TDC, right? To mid-bore, sorry, and then decels. So as that accelerates, we've got to look at the CFM demand that it's placing on the valve and then work at our curtain areas and see if we need a little bit more lift at 50 degrees of crank or whatever, and get it in its right phase so we can keep the curtain velocity in the valve as consistent as possible as well. Because we don't want the velocity at the seat super quick and then it goes super slow, because then we're going to lose that inertia because we've slowed that velocity down at the last point, right? It's like cracking a whip. You want to time it so we crack it at the end. You don't want to rip it really quickly and then just let it go, because it won't do anything. And it's the same. This is where race teams will get right into the data of how that valve is accelerating off the seat relative to what the piston is asking as far as how much air it needs. So then we look at, obviously, the size of the port, the induction length, and see if it's even tuned into the right window of where they're going to use it. Same as comp, same as cam, and just really run through the basics. Make sure we have enough piston speed, because that's the other problem we get of doing one at the moment. It's a circuit D-stroked LS, and I think they D-stroke them to like 4 liter, but and they do like 8,500 RPM, but the piston speed is too low. And most circuit cars, you need to be between that, 48 to 5,200 feet per minute to create inertia and get everything working right, get it all humming well. And they just don't, they're just not in the right range. So there's things like that. Or I just did some analysis on a V12, and same thing, the port and everything was too big for the RPM that they were targeting. So we either needed to put more cubes in it, put more stroke in it, or make the port smaller, right? So it's just really a lot of simple things that some people miss. And then on the other side, exhaust and trying to optimize scavenging and, with different cylinders and getting firing orders right. So I was helping one of the fastest Australian V8s here, NA drag car, and he was having dramas with plug color. So all these plugs looked good, except one was coming out with a bit of carbon on it. Anyway, he ended up sending me the pipes, and the 2-1 tri-Y type deal, not 4-1. So with those, you've got to make sure your firing order is separated at 180 degrees, and they hadn't on 2 of the cylinders. They're only 90 degrees separated. So one cylinder wasn't getting that evacuation that it needed, hence why it was leaving a bit more fuel in the chamber. And anyway, they ended up fixing that, and I think they made an extra 17 horsepower just by getting the firing order right on the pipe. So it's just little things that sometimes people they overlook, or they've got a lot of people involved in the project and not everyone communicates well. And I do the same. I get people just to throw eyes over what I'm doing, because sometimes a look from back here can see a little bit more. You can be too close to the subject sometimes,
Yeah, absolutely. A fresh set of eyes on any problem or any type of, solution you're trying to come up with is important, I think.
100%. Yep.
So a couple other questions I had. One was, what are some of the common mistakes you've seen circuit racers make when they mess with their induction systems?
Generally, too big a valve, too big an intake. So like too short, too much growth in the intake, so that they have these massive runners and the bell is, or the throat in the top of the plenum, so where the radius starts, is like 100% bigger than the port, where you should be, 30, 35%, even at 8,000 RPM, So that's a big one. And, too big a cylinder head is common, really, really common. Yeah. Like we had a full 1UZ. I specialize in 1UZs, do a lot of the for circuit and pretty much everything. We've done, jet boats and drag cars and circuit cars, but we had a customer, he got a fully set CNC'd heads, 2 mil over valves, everything. And the car ended up going 1.5 seconds slower than his PB with standard cylinder heads. So he rang me, he goes, I heard you're good with these. What do you think? I said, mate, you've put a valve that needs 10,000 RPM and you're doing 7,500. I said, standard valves. And we end up just getting a dirty old set, just did a bowl job and blended them, went back in, and he ended up going 2 seconds faster and got a 0.5 second PB just with a really, really easy hand porter job, because now the velocity was right for where he needed it to work, right? The big CNC'd heads had moved it up to 10,000 RPM. So they weren't even getting into their range to 8,000, and he was shifting at like 78 at the worst, right? So he just wasn't using that, which means it wasn't filling the cylinder, which means it wasn't horsepower and it wasn't torquing. It won't do either. So, and this is what I say to a lot of guys, you're generally always better off being on the smaller side because you'll always torque, right? You'll always make more torque, even if you cost yourself a little bit of horsepower. But if you end up too big, you won't horsepower and you won't torque. You miss the hill. You know what I mean?
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense. A buddy of mine had K24 BRZ and got a CNC head and all this stuff, and then couldn't make power with it, and then went back to a factory head, and it was fine. So it's definitely a problem. So
yeah. And it's a really big problem in the twin cam game, because we have this mentality from the 70s where head porters and engine guys, everything was too small in the 70s, right? Like whatever we took, whether it would be a small block Chevy with a little 194 valve or whatever it may be, everything was on the smaller side back then. But when the mid 90s, all the twin cam stuff, nearly everything I've seen is too big. And people are saying to me, oh, Jake, I want to put 1 mil, 1.5 mil valves in. I said, your valve's not the problem, man. I said, that valve won't choke to 9,000 RPM on a standard valve. So people are using that mentality from the 70s in the twin cam game, and it's total opposite. They're generally big enough. Like the RB26s in circuit stuff, I actually weld the dividers up and try and shrink the port a little bit, even though we still port them, but I attack the minimal cross-sectional area and get a better balanced cross-sectional area from the window to the valve. And they make more power. They got more torque. They go, And we see this even with boosted, because a lot of people don't realize all engines are boosted technically by 14.7 pounds of atmospheric pressure. So turbo can't change velocity. It only changes the density, the pressure ratio. So 10 pound is now 10 plus 14.7. So now we have a pressure differential across that induction of 24.7 PSI, right? So, and this is where a lot of people get caught into that trap, even with the turbo stuff, making them bigger, where we actually make them small and they make more horsepower. They come on earlier. Their boost threshold drops, meaning the point where they start to make boost can be 800, 1,000 RPM earlier. So now we have far more torque. Like at 3,500, we might be 30% higher just due to that boost threshold point and getting that velocity right. So yeah, definitely. I always tell guys, hunt on the smaller side, if anything, just under what's perfect.
Yeah, I think that's sound advice for sure, especially from some of the stuff I've seen lately. So yeah, that's awesome. Jake, I don't have anything else, my man. I think you put together. Are you guys trying to put out a video every month at least? Is that what you guys are doing?
We're trying every week.
Okay.
We're just, at the moment, we've got another shop we're building and trying to train my son up. And just the workload is, people don't realize it takes so much time to put stuff together. And even like to film a port job, the port job will take me, at least 20, 30% longer, where if I'm just hooking in and, at the moment, I think I've got, 14 intakes on, custom intakes that we're building at the moment. So it makes it hard to try and, break. And also I don't want to repeat a lot of stuff that's out there. So also working out what people want, what ideas, what they want to talk about. But yeah, we try for every week. And then in the new shop, we're going to build a podcast room and bring in engineers and different things and try and do a little bit of that as well, just to help. Yeah.
That'll be awesome. I'll be subscribing.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I'll be there.
No,
Don't
awesome.
So I really appreciate you coming on and sharing with us.
Not a problem.
Yeah, it's been a good time. Thanks a lot.
No, not a problem at all.
Until next time, keep working on yourself, keep working on the car, and let's get faster.